Good afternoon. I will call this meeting of the Standing Committee on Government Operations to order. Committee, we have an agenda before us. We have one item on the agenda today, a public review of the Office of the Information and Privacy Commissioner Annual Report. Do I have a member who would like to move to accept the agenda? Mr. McNeely, seconder. Mr. O'Reilly, thank you. All those in favor? Thank you. The agenda is accepted. Declarations of conflict of interest, I see none. We will get right into our only agenda item here. I want to welcome everyone to the public review of the Information and Privacy Commissioner of the Northwest Territories Annual Report for 2017-2018. It is the mandate of the Standing Committee on Government Operations to review statutory officers' annual reports. Committee, before we commence, I would like to ask the members to introduce themselves, starting with Mr. Thompson.
Good afternoon, Happy New Year, and welcome. Shane Thompson from the Handy.
Good afternoon, Danny McNeely, Satu Region.
Good afternoon, welcome. Michael Nadley, MLA for Detchel.
Kevin O'Reilly, Frame Lake.
Thank you, Committee, and I'm R.J. Simpson. I'm the Deputy Chair of the Standing Committee on Government Operations, and we have with us our Committee Clerk, Ms. Jennifer Franki-Smith, and our Legislative Advisor, Ms. April Taylor. So without further delay, I would like to turn the floor over to the Information and Privacy Commissioner, Ms. Elaine Keenan Bengts. Ms. Bengts, you may proceed with your presentation.
Thank you. Good afternoon to everyone, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to meet with you today to share with you some of the highlights of my 2017-2018 annual report. As you all know, my role is to provide independent oversight with respect to issues around access to public records, as well as with respect to how the GNWT and its agencies collect, use, and disclose personal information under the Access to Information and Protection of Privacy Act. In October of 2015, my office was given the additional mandate of independent oversight of access to information and protection of privacy in the health sector, including both governmental and non-governmental health organizations, with the coming into force with the Health Information Act. At the time that I was writing my annual report this year, Bill 29 had not yet been introduced in the Legislative Assembly. As a result, a good part of that annual report focused on the need to update the legislation. Coincidentally, however, Bill C-29 was introduced and received first reading on the exact same day that my ATIP report was tabled. And it has now received second reading and is in the public review stage. This is a major step forward, and I am, for the most part, very happy with the new provisions and excited to see it move forward. 2017-2018 saw another increase in the overall number of files opened by my office, from 69 files in fiscal 2016-2017 to 86 in 2017-2018. This is, of course, in addition to the 35 files opened in my role as the Information and Privacy Commissioner of Nunavut. There was a slight decrease in the number of files under the ATIP Act from 61 to 53, but a significant increase in the number of files under the Health Information Act, up to 33 from only 8 the previous year. Under the ATIP Act, the majority of the files continue to be issues surrounding access to information matters. Of the 53 files opened under ATIP, 24 of those related in some way to access to information. 13 related to privacy breach complaints or other issues surrounding privacy. I issued 18 review reports during the year, all of which are summarized in my annual report. Under the Health Information Act, there was a significant spike in the number of matters dealt with. Of the 33 files opened, the vast majority, 22, were breach notifications received from the Department of Health and Social Services or another health information custodian under the mandatory breach notification sections of the Act. Most of the reported breaches were relatively minor, but each such report has added to our ability to address gaps and holes in the system and and in procedures, and to adjust practices so as to prevent future breaches. The Department and the NWT Health and Social Services Authority have created a resource in which they now summarize each of the incidents that arise and are incorporating these examples into their training materials. This will undoubtedly help to reduce the number of similar breaches going forward. While I know the Department of Health has received a lot of negative publicity lately with respect to breaches of privacy, I'm actually pleased with the direction being taken by both the Department and the NWT Health and Social Services Authority to address privacy concerns, and I see an improvement when it comes to health information privacy efforts. I actually consider the increased number of reports as a positive development because it suggests that health information custodians are now recognizing breaches when they occur and are able to identify how they happened and to take steps to effect changes so that similar breaches can be avoided in the future. In most of the breaches reported to my office, the breach has been quickly discovered and addressed and the source of the error identified before the report even reaches my office, so that no full review or report is necessary. I do, however, review each of the notifications I receive, often ask additional questions and make suggestions for additional changes to policies or procedures, even when the breach has been appropriately handled by the custodian involved. The most often reported error in the health sector continues to be the continued use of fax technology for transmitting personal health information and health records, mostly from one facility to another. I'm currently in the final stages of preparing a report undertaken of my own motion with respect to the continued use of old technology where more current technology could be used to significantly reduce the chance of information going astray. There are better ways to communicate sensitive personal information than by a fax machine. I am, overall, much more satisfied with the way in which privacy issues are being dealt with by health information custodians under the Act. The level of awareness is definitely up, and senior management is, for the most part, supportive and willing to work towards improvement. As recent events have shown, however, work remains to be done. We are now dealing with two major breaches from the health sector, with the theft of an unencrypted laptop this past summer, and more recently the discovery of dated but extremely sensitive records in the dump in Fort Simpson. Both of these reviews are still in progress, but should be completed before my next annual report. It should be noted that the most recent breach involves records that were created long before the Health Information Act came into effect. It is still unclear where the records originated or who had custody and control of them, or for that matter, how they ended up in the dump. There's a lot of work yet to be done to identify where those records came from and how they found their way to the dump, and the ongoing investigations, actually my office and the departments will, I hope, answer most of the questions about these records, and there will undoubtedly be lessons learned. There has also been some progress in the development of policies as required by Section 8 of the Health Information Act. But additional work needs to be done in this sphere as well, particularly around the disclosure of personal health information. And there are still problems with masking and the ability of the patient to control how their personal health information is used and disclosed. The Act is still a complicated piece of legislation that is difficult to read and understand in full context, but 3 years in, progress is being made. The workload of my office remains a concern. The current legislation gives me 6 months to complete a review, but I have to confess that I have not been able to meet that deadline over the past year on a consistent basis. I currently have 27 files for which I've completed gathering the necessary information, which are waiting for me to write the report, and at least half of those were commenced more than 6 months ago. I did receive the budget increase to hire an employee to help ease the load for 2018-2019, but I have not for 2017-2018, but I have not yet been able to hire because we are still struggling with the job description and rating. In the meantime, I have hired a number of experts in the field on a contract basis to help me get through the backlog, and we are now starting to get the older files completed. Hopefully, I will have the position in the office filled early in the new fiscal year, and next year I will be able to report that we are current. As many of you know, I am very passionate about the work that I do and the importance that it has within the democratic process. I am grateful for the opportunity to serve and to be able to continue to serve my community as the Information and Privacy Commissioner for the Northwest Territories. It is a rewarding, if sometimes frustrating, job. Thank you for your attention, and I would invite any questions the committee might have for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Do we have any questions from committee members? Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I think we'll start with a really broad question, and I think you've answered parts of it in your annual report in your opening statement. But you know, we have a government that has really espoused principles of openness and transparency. They've developed an open government policy. We have a Minister of Public Engagement and Transparency. But I'd like you to talk about how those commitments really square with your experience, particularly on the access to information and privacy matters that you've dealt with over the last several years. How that commitment to openness and transparency really squares with your experience in viewing how our government complies with the Access to Information and Protection of Privacy Act. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Ms. Keenan Bengts?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. For the most part, I think that there is a healthy respect for the Act and what it's intended to do. There are pockets within government that are reluctant to accept that this is an important piece of legislation that requires respect and attention. I have found over the years that, now I'm going to preface this by saying I've been doing this for a long time, 23, 24 years now. And when the legislation first came into effect, there weren't a whole lot of requests. It was very slow. Things have changed a lot in the world over the last 20-some odd years. Information now is a prime commodity. So whether you're on the giving or the receiving side of things, it's a more complicated matter to deal with. Are my recommendations always accepted? No. Is there a trend towards accepting less of my recommendations? Yeah. Is it a serious change in direction? Not yet, but I'm concerned about it. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks. Yeah, that's helpful. Trends are important. One of the recommendations I know you made in your report, and maybe even can be used as a best practice, is what Newfoundland and Labrador have begun to do. And maybe we could get you to just talk a little bit about how they've sort of flipped the onus in terms of recommendations made by their commissioner there. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Ms. Keenan Bengts?
Sure. I could go on forever on this, so stop me if I'm going into too much detail. A few years ago, Newfoundland and Labrador was in a crisis in terms of its access and privacy legislation, so they hired 3 eminent experts, including the previous Privacy Commissioner for Canada and a former Premier and an eminent journalist to do a thorough review, and they did an excellent review of their legislation and produced a book that's this thick, which is now my Bible. it's just an excellent review of all of the legislation and its intents and what's being done around the world in various aspects of it. In the end, they proposed a new system for Newfoundland. So most of Canadian jurisdictions, like myself, have the power of an ombudsman. I don't make orders. I can't require anybody to do anything. I make recommendations. Ontario, BC, Alberta, and Prince Edward Island all have order-making powers. The rest of us are ombuds, have ombuds powers. In Newfoundland, what they've done is they've switched the onus, as you say. So the Information and Privacy Commissioner now still makes recommendations and has no power to order anyone to do anything. But if a public body wishes to disregard one of those recommendations, they're the ones who have to go to court for an order allowing them to do so. So there's kind of a second layer on the Information and Privacy Commissioner's review process. And the onus is shift to the government. And to me, that's a good thing, because in the 20-some-odd years that I've been doing this, I can count on one hand the number of matters that have gone to court, and that the reason for that is that individuals who make applications don't have the resources or the wherewithal or the know-how to bring an appeal to the court. And really, in my view, the onus should be on the government. If you're going to hire somebody with expertise and to make recommendations, and then you want to ignore those recommendations, and I think the onus is on the government or on the public body to bring the matter to court. It shouldn't be on the individual.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks. That's a good start. I'll defer to my colleagues. I've got a couple other things I'd like to follow up on, but thanks very much.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Next, we have Mr. Nadley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Commissioner, for your report. You noted that you're concerned about the continued use of fax technology. Is there any logical and rational reason why that kind of technology is still being used?
Thank you, Mr. Nadley. Ms. Keenan Bengts.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In a word, no. This is not just a problem here in the Northwest Territories. It is nationwide. For some reason, the medical profession is reluctant to adopt more secure technology. I don't think it's any worse here than any other part of Canada, but I do think that we need to do something to change it, because, like I said, did I say 22 of the files that I dealt with? No. In any event, it was by far the majority, and the number is in my report, had to do with misdirected faxes. And it's the medical profession's reluctance to change, I think, is where the issue lies there.
Thank you, Mr. Nadley.
Thank you. Thank you. You were saying that you're looking at perhaps a different system of trying to move away from that paper technology and the fax technology. What are perhaps some of the next steps that we could anticipate in terms of being in a position of support, in terms of maybe changing at least some movement away from fax technologies?
Thank you. Ms. Keenan Bengts.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, one of the issues, particularly in the north, is always connectivity. In the smaller communities, it's not always, the internet is not always as reliable as it could be. And I think often in the north, the reason that fax technology is used is because of the connectivity being difficult online. So there's one area that we can change. Like I say, I think the biggest problem here is the medical profession itself. If you can convince nurses, senior nurses, and doctors that it's just as easy to send an encrypted email as it is to stand up, walk to the fax machine, put it on the machine, send it, sit back down. You've got it made. It makes no sense to me, but I'm not in the business, and it's hard to change something that's been happening the same way for 50 years. So I do know the medical profession is working on it, but maybe the newest cohort of med school grads will be more apt to use the more modern technologies.
Thank you, Mr. Nadley. Nothing further from Mr. Nadley. I'll just follow up with his. I'll just follow up with Mr. Nadley's question. You stated that you were preparing a report undertaken on your own accord about the continued use of old technology, such as Mr. Nadley was talking about. Who is this report intended for? Is it going to be submitted to the Department of Health, or will it come to the Legislative Assembly? Could you, and maybe when is it going to be ready? If you could discuss some of those details. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would be submitting it to the Department of Health because they're the ones I've been working with on it. It will be a public document. It will be on my website, and I'd be happy to send it to the committee as well if that's your wish. As to when it will be completed, I'm so far behind. It is one of the older ones. I started it more than a year ago, so I'm hoping to have it out in the next month or so. Don't hold me to that, but that's my intention.
Thank you very much for that detail. Next, we have Mr. McNeely.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I too wanted to compliment you, Commissioner, on your passion in your closing remarks there. I can see by the length of time and the report you take a lot of consideration in doing your job, and I thank you for that. And I also picked up on you had mentioned that even though some of the complaints on the files come to your office and it has been rectified, you still do a follow-up. I think that's complimentary, and it really gives a tracking for improvement in quality control. And you mentioned fax machines, and I agree with the other presenters here. It's old technology. This government or this assembly has invested $70 million to improve that technology called the fiber optic, but there's a lack of information going from the end user to the decision-making authority, which I think really needs incorporation into the report on how to rectify to a modern electronic age. I'm from the small communities. When I go to the nursing station in Fort Good Hope and I hear directly from the staff, we are not connected to this fiber optic. When I go to Toledo, I hear the same thing. So why isn't this government utilizing its own resources and its own assets to improve the system from aging mechanics of fax machine, which no longer in some offices do not exist? And by the numbers of complaints, this old technology is actually generating complaints and public sharing of personal information. So the resolution is maybe we should be asking this government, why are you not using your own investment? So once we identify a resolution in that terminology to rectify elimination of the fax machine, people would be more aware that these health centers are not hooked up to the system, and therefore raise the question, why not? So I just point that out for the record to share what I see in the smaller communities. Yes, we may be remote, but we're hooked up to the fiber optic. It goes to the Northwest Tel building in Fort Good Hope and all the communities, and it goes back out of town again. And there's a gap missing from the health center to the RCMP to the frontline worker buildings, whether it's a school as well, to the connection. We're still connected, yes, but by copper line, not the glass tubes. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McNeely. Would you like to respond?
I will, and I agree with everything you've said, but that's not the whole story. You have to get those who work in the system to adopt the new technology. This isn't happening only because of communities misdirecting faxes. These problems are happening in Yellowknife and all of the larger communities as well. It's a matter of adopting appropriate technology within the system, and for that you have to change the way the medical profession does its business. Thank you.
Thank you. Anything further from Mr. McNeely?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, no, that's good. That's a good recognition, and should be noted as well. Resolutions to that could be said in a number of ways: additional training, additional hiring, say, of a designated communication individual that specializes in that transmission. So those are some comments I share with you to not only stop just because there's a problem with our current staff. There is always resolution to every issue. Some might take a little more than that, but nevertheless, I think there always is improvements. In this day and age, one has to step back and look back at on the principles of review and efficiencies before moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next we have Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess when we talk about faxes and that and modern technology, my colleague here talked about, fiber optic link going right by the communities, but we don't have access to it. And so, have you talked to the government about, especially with health, to tap into this resource? Because as Mr. McNeely talked about, it goes into the Northwest Health Building and then takes off. It doesn't go into the government buildings there, and so it's not accessible. So have you addressed that? Because sometimes faxes are the only things that seem to be working or accessible for these communities. So have you approached this? Have you looked at this? Have you talked to the government about this? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think, frankly, that goes way beyond my jurisdiction. I can make suggestions about the use of technology. How that technology gets into place is way beyond what I can do. I know that work is being done on the fiber optic technology. But I have not engaged in conversations with any government department about the creation of a better underpinning for being able to use the technology that would make it more privacy protective. No.
Thank you. Anything further, Mr. Thompson?
Thank you. I appreciate the answer. I guess that's something that this government needs to recognize and start working to help you do your job better, and people to make sure records are, the privacy issue is dealt with in a more serious manner. In regards to the situation in Fort Simpson, I'm not going to talk about the situation itself. When you do the final report, is that made public so the residents of the region are well aware of what the findings were and what happened, and so people are informed, so instead of the innuendos out there? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. And just to be clear, the situation in Fort Simpson is the medical records found in the dump. Is that what you're referring to?
Correct.
Thank you. Commissioner?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, all of my recommendations, all of my reports are public. They eventually get put onto my website. Again, I'm a little behind there because of manpower issues, but so the way this is going to work is right now I'm waiting to receive from the Department of Health, and it will take some time for them to do it because I know it's really only starting today. I'll get a copy of their investigation report. They're doing all of the heavy lifting on this in terms of figuring out what happened, because they have the resources to do it. They have the background and the history and everything else. They're the only ones who can really do that part of it. Once they complete their report, they'll be providing me with a copy of that report. I do not know if it's their intention, the department's intention, to make that report public. I have no control over that. I will use that report and do my own additional investigation, whatever investigation I feel appropriate or necessary, to come up with my report and make recommendations as to what should be done going forward. I expect that the department's report will also contain recommendations, but I will make my own recommendations based partially on that report and based on my own review of it. So right now, for me, it's a bit of a waiting game until I get more information from the government as a result of their investigation as to exactly where these records came from. In the meantime, and I know this has been in the news, but I wanted to reiterate that the records that were recovered are in my possession and remain in my possession and will remain in my possession. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Thompson?
Thank you, and I appreciate that answer. I guess my next question is that, again, we're trying to find out where these files are coming from. I guess my question is that how many cases have we heard of or you've seen that have been developed before the Health Information Act came into effect? Because there's some questions on when these files were, where they were, what they hold or involved is. How many other cases are you aware of that are outside the scope of when the Health Information Act was before it became in effect? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner.
I don't think that they are outside the scope of the Act. I don't care when they were created. If they're records that contain personal health information, the day that the Act came into effect, they became subject to the Act. The problem in this case, I think, is that they were created 20 to 30 years ago, and the most recent dates on them are more than, I'd say more than 15, almost 20 years old, the most recent dates, which means they've been sitting someplace for a long time that nobody has paid much attention to. And they just kind of weren't considered in light of the Act. Without reaching any conclusions, I think that's what happened here. I don't want to, because there's so much we don't know just yet. I don't want to make a whole lot of comment about it. But I'm sure there are other records out there, whether they were created by a government or a government agency or a government contractor, that were created long before the Act came into effect, that contain what we would now consider to be personal health information. And I do think the department, there's already been a wake-up call. I think the department is already considering where else should we be looking for files like this. Lessons have already been learned, I think. So as far as I'm concerned, as I say, I think if it contains personal health information, the Act applies. But the question is, who had possession, and were they in the possession and control of what would now be considered a health information custodian? None of those questions have been answered yet. I hope that helps.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson.
Yeah, thanks, and I appreciate that. helps clarify. I wasn't talking about specifically. I'm just seeing what out there, and I'm glad to hear that we've heard that the government or the department has already learned lessons learned, and they're starting to look at that out there. Because again, if you look at the system in itself, way back when, it used to not be the government. It used to be agencies outside that looked after that, and that's the scary part. Is that when the government's taken over, where are these files and that? So I'm glad to hear this is being looked at, and as we move forward, we'll find out the information. I'd just like to thank you very much for your work. I appreciate it. I mean, it's very tiring, I would say, and you're doing a great job, and I thank you very much for it. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Round 2 of questions. Mr. O'Reilly, did you have more?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I'm just looking at your website, and I know it was in your annual report as well. There are 3 lesson plans that you have posted to your website in English. It'd be great to get them in French as well. They deal with things like online information, value of privacy, privacy rights of children and teens, and 2 of them are for grades 6 to 8, and others from, I think, 9 to 12, so high school kids. And I just had a quick look through some of them before you arrived, and there's some really good practical information in there, but also it makes kids think about some of these things in our modern context. Do you know what kind of uptake there has been with any of these lesson plans? Are you getting any feedback from any of the teachers or schools about the availability of this resource? And I think it's a great thing, but thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Number one, I cannot take credit for those lesson plans. I was involved in the committee that created them, which was a committee made up of employees of the Information and Privacy Commissioners from across the country. And since I'm the only employee in the Northwest Territories, it was my job. They're great resources. In other parts of the country, they're being used quite widely, is my understanding. In some jurisdictions, I have had no feedback, and I don't know if anyone in the Northwest Territories is using them. I do know that there are more lesson plans in the works amongst our committee. We're trying to work on that. BC has a great, the BC Information and Privacy Commissioner's Office, which is a bit of it's the envy of some of us, shall we say, in terms of their resources and the number of people they have to do outreach sorts of things. And I know that they've done quite a bit of work in this area. The Information and Privacy Commissioners from across Canada are always willing and for me to steal, and I use that word quite literally. I steal and I use their materials all the time. The resources that are out there are incredible. It's just a matter of getting them together, getting them out in the public knowledge. I'm not sure that the Department of Education, Culture and Employment even knows they're there. And perhaps that's my fault because I haven't told them. But again, lack of resources, and I have to kind of prioritize what I do and what I don't do. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks. No, that's very helpful, and I think we've heard in the past that you are part of a bigger network of commissioners from across the NW or across Canada that deal with some of these issues. Are these lesson plans, are they available in French as well? Do you know? Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. They might be, and I'm going to go back to my office and I'm going to ask whether they are, and if they are, I will certainly post them in French as well.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, that'd be great. Merci beaucoup. Also, you know, telling ECE is one thing, but maybe letting the NWT Teachers Association know. Those guys have a a really good newsletter, and I'm sure they could probably maybe even work with you to write up a little story about the availabilities of these things. Because I think my experience is if you can get something into the hands of a teacher, they'll use it, even if it sort of goes outside of ECE or whatever. So just another maybe suggestion about getting these great resources out there to teachers and students. So thanks.
Thank you. Would you like to respond, Commissioner?
Yeah, and you make a good point in terms of teachers using resources outside, and that's a bit of a problem in some cases. In Southern Canada, some of the programs being used as teaching resources that have not been approved by school boards and such like turn out to be very privacy invasive type of programs. So I will take you up on that as well, and I will reach out to the Teachers Association. Thank you.
Thank you. Anything further, Mr. O'Reilly?
No, thanks. That's it for now for me, Mr. Chair. Thanks.
Thank you. Anything further from committee? I have some questions arising from the report. You note that Nunavut recently amended its act to accommodate the inclusion of municipalities under ATIP, and I was wondering, you know, there's been some high-profile issues concerning municipalities in the Northwest Territories, and so I was wondering what your take on Nunavut's experience is. Do the municipalities seem to have the capacity to comply with the legislation? You know, if someone puts in a request, do they have the ability to process that request? Do you have any insight on that, Commissioner?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Nunavut has been at this for a number of years in terms of getting municipalities included under the Act. There are no municipalities yet subject to the Act. They've passed the legislation, much like the legislation Bill 29 does. It provides for the inclusion of municipalities without actually including them just yet. That's the next step. The problem in Nunavut has been from the get-go that not one of their municipalities, not even Iqaluit, which is the largest municipalities, has a records management system in place that would allow for, shall we say, the easy search for records. Iqaluit, for instance, has their historical records are piled in boxes in a storeroom. The boxes are not well labeled or dated or organized. A historical search and access to information request for historical records would be difficult, if not impossible. I would like to think that the larger communities in Northwest Territories have at least basic information management systems, but I don't know. I suspect that Yellowknife does. How long it's had it, I don't know. Is there a capacity within the city of Yellowknife or the other larger communities in Northwest Territories to be subject to the Act? They're going to need a little help. They're certainly going to need expertise that's not there, training. There's going to have to be a good, hard look at the information management systems historically and otherwise. It may be, and I've suggested this in Nunavut, that when the Act comes into effect for municipalities, that there be a restriction on historical requests, because they're just not going to be able to answer them. They're just not going to be able to without without huge manpower. So yeah, I think there's work that has to be done ahead of including our municipalities. That said, as you all know, I think every annual report that I've ever done for 20-some years has said we have to include municipalities under this Act. And the reason is they expend public funds and they hold personal information. There is no reason for them not to be included as public bodies under the Act. Are they going to need more resources? Probably. Are they going to be able to hit the ground running? Not tomorrow, but within a year, they should be able to ramp up to it, at least the larger communities. Thank you.
Thank you. So it sounds like there could be some significant costs associated with getting to the point where municipalities, could comply with the legislation. Given what you know about the municipalities in the territory, do you foresee there being some large upfront costs, Commissioner?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. There doesn't need to be. What there needs to be is a careful look at what there is. And if the historical records are in the same kind of state as they are in Iqaluit, maybe we're going to have to look at restricting historical searches for information and just do it on a go-forward basis. I don't know. I really don't know, because most of the municipalities have been very reluctant to engage with me in terms of access and privacy issues. I've reached out a number of times over the years, particularly with the City of Yellowknife, but also with other municipalities, and have had no feedback. I don't even get a response to my correspondence. So they're reluctant, and I understand why they're reluctant. Is there going to need some work done at the front end? Yes, absolutely. I don't know whether there's going to be a need for a huge expenditure of funds, because I don't know what they have in terms of, I said, records management systems. On the privacy side of things, there shouldn't be a whole lot of expenditure at all. Privacy is a matter of keeping things in. And I've also recommended in Nunavut that they start with the privacy side of things, because it is easier to implement. It's more complicated, but it's easier to implement, if that makes any sense. It probably doesn't, but there has to be some hardware and software in place for access to information. Privacy is more a matter of policy and implementing policy and teaching people about the policies than it is about spending money. I hope that helps.
Yeah, and you said you reached out to some of the tax-based municipalities, and you haven't received any responses. Have you reached out to all of them?
No, over the years, and this isn't just yesterday or the day before, over the years, when things have arisen that have come to my attention about issues in one of the municipalities, I've often written a letter saying, I'm here to help. Tell me what you need. Do you want to sit down and talk? And I haven't had any uptake. So, that's not true. Way back when I had one meeting with the City of Yellowknife. I think you might have been there.
All right, thank you for those answers. Is there anything further from committee? Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. When I was on City Council many years ago, we did bring forward a motion to the Northwest Territories Association of Communities to ask that at least the tax-based municipalities be brought under the legislation, because, I think it's just in keeping with good governance that citizens are able to access information. So, but in any event, I had another question for you, and I know the purpose of this meeting is to talk about your report. I don't want to delve into the details of what's in Bill 29, but I just want to get at a high level. If there was, say, 2 or 3 things that you think we should be looking for in the efforts to modernize our access to information protection and privacy legislation, what would those be? What should we as legislators be looking for in the modernization of the legislation? Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Commissioner?
I can give you 2 right off the top of my head. And the first one, way up there, is a breach notification requirement, which is not in Bill 29. And I say that as a result of the lessons learned from the Health Information Act, which does have a breach notification requirement. We've learned so much from those breach notifications. And I said, like I say, it's not a negative thing that I'm getting so many reports. To me, it's a positive thing, because it means that these breaches are being recognized, dealt with, and we're moving on and learning things from them. breach notification, Nunavut actually was a pioneer in requiring all public bodies under a recent amendment, I think it was 2012, they required all public bodies to notify certain people, including my office, of breaches. They were the first in Canada. Newfoundland now has a similar provision. BC, I think, is heading that way. So it's one of the things that is becoming, is starting to roll out in most of the jurisdictions. This is our chance, and I would really like to see that included in Bill 29, and you will hear more about that from me down the line next week, I guess, at the public hearings. The second thing that I would say is a requirement to do privacy breach, privacy impact assessments when new projects, programs, and software is being rolled out. Privacy impact assessments are a great tool for making sure that that privacy aspects of a new program are being at least acknowledged at the front end. It's not a matter of saying if you can't protect privacy, you can't do it. It's a matter of this is how it's going to impact privacy, and makes people think about it. It's not. Privacy is not one of those things that is on top of mind when you're dealing with an exciting new project or an exciting new application, right? It's what it can do to make life easier. It's not about the privacy, but with privacy impact assessments, you have to at least look at that and acknowledge that there are or there are not privacy impacts, and address maybe how they can be reduced or controlled or managed. So a requirement for privacy impact assessments would be my second go-to.
Thank you. Anything further, Mr. O'Reilly?
No, thanks. I appreciate those suggestions, and I really look forward to the Commissioner participating in our public hearing on Bill 29 to update the Access to Information Protection and Privacy Act. Thanks for those comments today.
Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. And just for the public's knowledge, that public meeting will be where the Commissioner will be presenting is on January 24th, and that will be held here in Yellowknife at 7 p.m. Next Thursday. And the committee will be traveling on that bill, looking for public feedback. We'll be in Fort Smith on the 21st, Nunavut on the 22nd, and Fort McPherson on the 23rd. So there will be ample time for the public to have input on that bill. Do we have anything further from committee? No, I have one final question, and this is regarding the Health Information Act, and this has been an ongoing issue. There's a provision in the Health Information Act that allows patients to request that certain parts of their medical record be essentially hidden from certain either individuals or organizations. So if your neighbor is a pharmacist and you don't want them to have access to certain parts of your medical record, you have the right to request that. However, the last time that the Commissioner was in front of us, the ability to do that didn't exist. The electronic record system didn't allow for that to happen. It's my understanding that the Health Department has been making efforts, and the Health Authority has been making efforts to make that a reality. Do you have any comments on what you've heard about that progress on that front, Commissioner?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I haven't had much of an update on that in recent months. My understanding is that they're still struggling with it in terms of making the software work and allow them to do that. So I think it's still an issue. As far as I know, I haven't heard to the contrary. And frankly, I've been on them enough that I think that if they were able to fix that problem, they'd be telling me about it pretty quick. Thank you.
And there's also been cases where it's not a software issue, but perhaps someone is going for counseling, and they don't want their information exposed to other people in that clinic. Yet there's weekly meetings where the counselors all get together and sort of discuss clients in case someone has to take over for someone else. Are you aware of any concerns from the public on that front? Because, you can, while there may be software to help protect records, electronic medical records, there's not necessarily when it comes to people chatting amongst themselves in clinics and in medical settings. Are you aware of any issues regarding that, and anything the department's doing to tackle that issue?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's a really interesting issue because counselors, in particular, I've received more letters of concern from counselors working within the system than any other group of people. The counselors are really concerned about the privacy of their patients, their clients' information, and they have raised all sorts of concerns with me about the way in which the system allows access to to things that they believe should be private. Counselors are probably the most privacy protective group within the medical system. That's my experience in terms of this work in any event. Are there problems? Yeah, there are problems. I've had a number of complaints. I'm dealing with a number of issues right now where particular counseling records are the cause of concern. But that's not because the counselors are getting together and chatting about it. In fact, I think that's one of the way they work is they get together in a circle and they talk about cases without revealing identities. That's how they deal with it. Their concern is that the identities are attached to the counseling records when they are put on the system. Yes, it's an issue, and it continues to be an issue, and it's one of the masking issue is still a big one, and I suppose that's the best we can. That's the best I can say about it right now. I think it's still being worked on, and hopefully by the time the Act is 5 years old, there'll have been some progress. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Is there anything further from committee? Seeing nothing, I want to thank the Commissioner for appearing before us. This concludes our review of the annual report, and on behalf of the committee, I would like to thank the Information and Privacy Commissioner for joining us today and for all her hard work throughout the year.
The committee will be producing its own report on the review.
And the committee, as usual, will be producing and tabling our own report on the Commissioner's report. So with that, committee, we are adjourned.